On New Year's morning, sometime after breakfast, a cold morning, air temperature in the 40s, the grass wet and cold, they drove up the mountain along a muddy track and parked in a small valley below Kiddum Cave. They bushwhacked up the valley, following elephant trails that meandered beside a little stream that ran through the strands of olive trees and grassy meadows. They kept an eye out for Cape buffalo, a dangerous animal to encounter in the forest. The cave opened at the head of the valley, and the stream cascaded over its mouth. The elephant trails joined at the entrance and headed inside. Monet and his friend spent the whole of New Year's Day there. It probably rained, and so they would have sat in the entrance for hours while the little stream poured down in a vale. Looking across the valley, they'd watch for elephants, and they saw rock hyraxes, furry animals the size of groundhogs, running up and down the boulders near the mouth of the cave. Herds of elephants go inside Kiddum Cave at night to obtain minerals and salts. On the plains, it's easy for elephants to find salt in hard pans and the dry water holes, but in rainforests, salt is a precious thing. The cave is large enough to hold as many as 70 elephants at a time, and they spend the night in the cave, dozing on their feet or mining the rock with their tusks. They pry and gouge rocks off the walls and chew them to fragments between their teeth and swallow the broken bits of rock. Elephant dung around the cave is full of crumpled rock. Monet and his friend had a flashlight, and they walked back into the cave to see where it went. The mouth of the cave is huge, 55 yards wide, and it opens out even wider beyond the entrance. They crossed a platform covered with powdery dry elephant dung, their feet kicking up puffs of dust as they advanced. The light grew dim, and the floor of the cave rose upward in a series of shelves coated with green slime. The slime was bat guano, digested vegetable matter that had been excreted by a colony of fruit bats on the ceiling. Bats whirred out of holes and flickered through their flashlight beams, dodging around their heads, making high-pitched cries. Their flashlights disturbed the bats, and more bats woke up. Hundreds of bat eyes like red jewels looked down on them from the ceiling of the cave. Waves of bat sound rippled across the ceiling and echoed back and forth, a dry, squeaky sound like many small doors being opened on dry hinges. Then they saw the most wonderful thing about Kiddum Cave. The cave is a petrified rainforest. Mineralized logs stuck out of the walls and ceiling. They were trunks of rainforest trees turned to stone, teaks, podo trees, evergreens. An eruption of Mount Elgin about 7 million years ago had buried the rainforest in ash, and the logs had been transformed into opal and chert. The logs were surrounded by crystals, white needles of material that had grown out of the rock. The crystals were as sharp as hypodermic needles, and they glittered in the beams of the flashlights. Monet and his friend wandered through the cave, shining their lights on the petrified rainforest. Did he run his hands over the stone trees and prick his finger on a crystal? They found petrified bones sticking out of the ceilings and walls. Bones of crocodiles and bones of ancient hippos and ancestors of elephants. There were spiders hanging in webs among the logs. The spiders were eating moths and insects. They came to a gentle rise, where the main chamber widened to more than 100 yards across, wider than the length of a football field. They found a crevice and shined their lights down to the bottom. There was something strange down there, a mass of gray and brownish material. It was the mummified corpse of baby elephants. When elephants walk through the cave at night, they navigate by their sense of touch, probing the floor ahead of them with the tips of their trunks. Sometimes, the babies would fall into the crevice. Monet and his friend continued deeper into the cave, descending a slope until they came to a pillar that seemed to support the roof. The pillar was scored with hatch marks and grooves the marks of elephant tusks. The elephants continued to dig away at the base of the pillar, and it might eventually collapse, bringing down the roof of Kiddum Cave with it. At the back of the cave, they found another pillar. This one was broken. Over it hung a velvety mass of bats, which had fouled the pillar with black guano, a different kind of guano from the green slime near the mouth of the cave. These bats were insect eaters, and the guano was an ooze of digested insects. Did Monet put his hand in the ooze? Monet's friend dropped out of sight for several years after that trip to Mount Elgin. Then, unexpectedly, she surfaced in a bar near Mombasa where she was working as a prostitute. A Kenyan doctor who had investigated the Monet case happened to be drinking a beer in the bar and struck up a conversation with her and mentioned Monet's name. He was stunned when she said, "I know about that. I come from Western Kenya. I was the woman with Charles Monet." He didn't believe her, but she told him the story in enough detail that he became convinced she was telling the truth. She vanished after that meeting in the bar, lost in the warrens of Mombasa. By now, she's probably died of AIDS. Charles Monet returned to his job at the pump house at the sugar factory. He walked to work each day across the burned cane fields, no doubt admiring the view of Mount Elgin. And when the mountain was buried in clouds, perhaps he could still feel its pull, like the gravity of an invisible planet. Meanwhile, something was making copies of itself inside Monet. A life form had acquired Charles Monet as his host, and it was replicating. The headache begins, typically on the 7th day after exposure to the agent. On the 7th day after his New Year's visit to Kiddum Cave, January 8, 1980, Monet felt a throbbing pain behind his eyeballs. He decided to stay home from work and went to bed in his bungalow. The headache grew worse. His eyeballs ached, and then his temples began to ache, the pain seeming to circle around inside his head. It would not go away with aspirin, and then he got a severe backache. His housekeeper, Johnny, was still on her Christmas vacation, and he had recently hired a temporary housekeeper. She tried to take care of him, but she really didn't know what to do. Then on the 3rd day after his headache started, he became nauseated, spiked a fever, and began to vomit. His vomiting grew intense and turned into dry heaves. At the same time, he became strangely passive. His face lost all appearance of life and set into an expressionless mask, with the eyeballs fixed, paralytic and staring. The eyelids were slightly droopy, which gave him a peculiar appearance, as if his eyes were popped out of his head and half closed at the same time. The eyeballs themselves seemed almost frozen in their sockets, and they turned a bright red. The skin of his face had turned yellowish, with brilliant star-like red speckles. He began to look like a zombie. His appearance frightened the temporary housekeeper. She didn't understand the transformation in this man. His personality changed. He'd become sullen and resentful, angry, and his memories seemed to be blown away. He was not delirious. He could answer questions, although he didn't seem to know exactly where he was. When Monet failed to show up for work, his colleagues began to wonder about him, and eventually they came to his bungalow to see if he was all right. The black and white crow sat on the roof and watched them as they went inside. They looked at Monet and decided he needed to get to a hospital. Since he was very unwell and no longer able to drive a car, one of his co-workers drove him to the private hospital in the city of Kisumu, on the shore of Lake Victoria. The doctors at the hospital examined Monet and could not come up with any explanation for what had happened to his eyes, his face, or his mind. Thinking it might be some kind of bacteria, they gave him injections of antibiotics, but the antibiotics had no effect on his illness. The doctors thought he should go to Nairobi Hospital, which is the best private hospital in East Africa. The telephone system hardly worked, and it did not seem worth the effort to call any doctors to tell him that he was coming. He would still walk, and he seemed to be able to travel by himself. He had money. He understood he had to get to Nairobi. They put him in a taxi to the airport, and he boarded Kenyan Airways flight. A hot virus from the rainforest lives within a 24-hour plane flight from every city on Earth. All of the Earth cities are connected by a web of airline routes. This web is a network. Once the virus hits the net, it can shoot anywhere in a day. Paris, Tokyo, New York, Los Angeles, everywhere planes fly. Charles Monet and the life form inside him had entered the net. The plane was a Fokker Friendship with propellers, a commuter aircraft that seats 35 people. It started its engines and took off over Lake Victoria, blue and sparkling, dotted with the dugout canoes of fishermen. The Friendship turned and banked eastward, climbing over green hills quilted with tea plantations and small farms. The commuter flights that drone across Africa are often jammed with people, and this flight was probably full. The plane climbed over belts of forest and clusters of round huts and villages with tin roofs. The land suddenly dropped away, going down in shelves and ravines and changing in color from green to brown. The plane was crossing the East Rift Valley. Passengers looked out the windows at the place where the human species was born. They saw specks of huts clustered inside circles of thorn bush, with the cattle trails radiating from the huts. The propellers moaned and the Friendship passed through cloud streets, lines of puffy rift clouds that began to bounce and sway. Monet became airsick. The seats are narrow and jammed together on these commuter airplanes, and you notice everything that is happening inside the cabin. The cabin is tightly closed, and the air recirculates. If there are any smells in the air, you perceive them. You would not have been able to ignore the man who was getting sick. He hunches over in his seat. There's something wrong with him, but you can't tell exactly what is happening. He holds his air sickness bag over his mouth, and he coughs a deep cough and regurgitates something into the bag. The bag swells up. Perhaps he glances around, and then you see that his lips are smeared with something slippery and red, mixed with black specks as if he'd been chewing coffee grounds. His eyes are the color of rubies, and his face is an expressionless mass of bruises. The red spots, which a few days before had started as star-like speckles, have expanded and merged into a huge, spontaneous purple shadows. His whole head is turning black and blue. The muscles of his face droop, the connective tissue in his face is dissolving, and his face appears to hang from his underlying bone, as if the face is detaching itself from the skull. He opens his mouth and gasps into the bag, and the vomit goes on endlessly. It will not stop, and he keeps bringing up liquid long after his stomach should have emptied. The air sickness bag begins to fill to the brim with a substance known as vomito negro, or the black vomit. Or the black vomit isn't really black. It's a speckled liquid of two colors, black and red. A stew of tarry granules mixed with fresh arterial blood. It is a hemorrhage, and it smells like a slaughterhouse. The black vomit is loaded with virus. It is highly infective, lethally hot, a liquid that would scare the daylights out of a military bioweapons hazard specialist. The smell of the vomito negro filled the passenger cabin. The air sickness bag is brimming with black vomit, so Monet closes the bag and rolls up the top. The bag is bulging and softening, threatening to leak. He hands it to a flight attendant. When a hot virus multiplies in a host, it can saturate the body with virus particles from the brain to the skin. The military experts then say that the virus has undergone extreme amplification. This is not something like the common cold. By the time an extreme amplification peaks out, an eyedropper of a victim's blood may contain 100 million particles of virus. During this process, the body is partially transformed into a virus particle. In other words, the host is possessed by a life form that is attempting to convert the host into itself. The transformation is not entirely successful, however, and the end result is a great deal of liquefying flesh mixed with virus, a kind of biological accident. Extreme amplification has occurred in Monet, and the sign of it is the black vomit. He appears to be holding himself rigid, as if Any movement would rupture something inside him. His blood is clotting up. His bloodstream is throwing clots, and the clots are lodging everywhere. His liver, kidneys, lungs, hands, feet, and head are becoming jammed with blood clots. In effect, he is having a stroke through the whole body. Clots are accumulating in his intestinal muscles, cutting off the blood supply to his intestines. The intestinal muscles are beginning to die, and the intestines are starting to go slack. He doesn't seem fully aware of the pain any longer, because the blood clots have also lodged in his brain and are cutting off blood flow. His personality is being wiped away by brain damage. This is called depersonalization, in which the liveliness and details of the character seem to vanish. He is becoming an automaton. Tiny spots in his brain are liquefying. The higher functions of consciousness are winking out first, leaving the deeper parts of the brainstem, the primitive rat brain, the lizard brain, still alive and functioning. It could be said that the who of Charles Monet has already died, while the what of Charles Monet continues to live. The vomiting attack appears to have broken some blood vessels in his nose. He gets a nosebleed. The blood comes from both nostrils, a shiny, clotless arterial liquid that drips over his teeth and chin. The blood keeps running because the clotting factors have all been used up. A flight attendant gives him some paper towels, which he uses to stop up his nose, but the blood still won't coagulate, and the towels soak through. When a man is getting sick in an airline seat next to you, you may not want to embarrass him by calling attention to the problem. You say to yourself, this man will be alright. Maybe he doesn't travel well in airplanes. He's airsick, the poor man, and people do get nosebleeds in airplanes. The air is so dry and thin, and you ask him weakly if there's anything you can do to help. He doesn't answer, or he mumbles words and you can't understand, so you try to ignore it. But the flight seems to go on forever. Perhaps the flight attendants offer to help him, but victims of this type of hot virus have changes in behavior that can render them incapable of responding to offers of help. They become hostile and don't want to be touched. They don't want to speak. They answer questions with grunts or monosyllables. They can't seem to find words. They can't tell you their name, but they can tell you the day of the week or explain what has happened to them. The friendship drones through clouds, following the length of the Rift Valley, and Monet slumps back in his seat and now seems to be dozing. Perhaps some of the passengers are wondering if he's dead. No, he isn't dead. He is moving. His red eyes are open and moving around a little bit. It is late afternoon, and the sun is falling down into the hills to the west of the Rift Valley, throwing blades of light in all directions as the sun is cracking up on the equator. The Friendship makes a gentle turn and crosses the eastern scarp of the rift. The land rises higher and higher and changes in color from brown to green. The Nong Hills appear under the right wing, and the plane, now descending, passes over parkland dotted with zebras and giraffes. A minute later, it lands at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. Monet stirs himself. He's still able to walk. He stands up dripping. He stumbles down the gangway onto the tarmac, his shirt a red mess. He carries no luggage. His only luggage is internal, and it is a load of amplified virus. Monet has been transformed into a human virus bomb. He walks slowly into the airport terminal and through the building and out to a curving road where taxis are always parked. The taxi drivers surround him. Taxi, Nairobi Hospital, he mumbles. One of them helps him into a car. Nairobi taxi drivers like to chat with their fares, and this one probably asks if he's sick. The answer should be obvious. Monet's stomach feels a little better now. It is heavy, dull, and bloated, as if he's eaten a meal, rather than empty and torn and on fire. The taxi pulls out onto the Uhuru Highway that heads into Nairobi. It goes through grasslands studded with honey acacia trees, and it goes past factories and then it comes to a rotary and enters the bustling street life of Nairobi. Crowds are milling on the shoulders of the road, women walking on a beaten dirt pathway, men loitering, children riding bicycles, a man repairing shoes by the side of the road, a tractor pulling a wagon load of charcoal. The taxi turns left on the Nung Road and goes past a city park and up a hill, past lines of tall blue gum trees, and it turns up a narrow road and goes past a guard gate and enters the grounds of Nairobi Hospital. It parks at a taxi stand beside a flower kiosk. A sign by the glass door says Casualty Department. Monet hands the driver some money and gets out of the taxi and opens the glass door and goes over to the reception window and indicates that he is very ill. He has difficulty speaking. The man is bleeding, and they will admit him in just a moment. He must wait until a doctor can be called, but the doctor will see him immediately. Not to worry. He sits down in the waiting room. It is a small room lined with padded benches. The clear, strong, ancient light of East Africa pours through a row of windows and falls across a table heaped with soiled magazines, mixed rectangles on the pebbled gray floor that has a drain in the center. The room smells vaguely of wooden smoke and sweat, and it is jammed with bleary-eyed people, Africans and Europeans sitting shoulder to shoulder. There is always someone in Casualty who has a cut and is waiting for stitches. People wait patiently, holding a washcloth against the scalp, holding a bandage pressed to a finger, and you may see a spot of blood on the cloth. Sir Charles Monet is sitting on a bench in Casualty, and he does not look very much different from anyone else in the room, except for his bruised, expressionless face and his red eyes. A sign on the wall warns patrons to watch out for purse thieves and says, "Please maintain silence. Your cooperation will be appreciated. Note, this is the Casualty Department. Emergency cases will be taken in priority. You may be required to wait for such cases before receiving attention." Monet maintains silence, waiting to receive attention. Suddenly, he goes into the last phase. The human virus bomb explodes. Military biohazard specialists have ways of describing this occurrence. They say that the victim has crashed and bled out, or more politely, they say the victim has gone down. He becomes dizzy, utterly weak, and his spine goes limp and nerveless, and he loses all sense of balance. The room is turning around and around. He's going into shock. He leans over, head on his knees, and brings up an incredible quantity of blood from his stomach and spills it onto the floor with a gasping groan. He loses consciousness and pitches forward onto the floor. The only sound is a choking in his throat as he continues to vomit blood and black matter while unconscious. Then comes the sound like a bedsheet being torn in half, which is the sound of his bowels opening and venting blood from the anus. The blood is mixed with intestinal lining. He has slothed his gut. The lining of his intestines have come off and are being expelled along with huge amounts of blood. Monet has crashed and is bleeding out. The other patients in the waiting room stand up and move away from the man on the floor, calling for a doctor. Pools of blood spread out around him, enlarging rapidly. Having destroyed its host, the hot agent is coming out of every orifice and is trying to find a new host.